We are in a series called Glad You Asked That. I want to deal with a question that nobody turned in, but it's an incredible question. I think it can change the trajectory of our life. It was asked by a man named Jeremiah Lamphere. Jeremiah Lamphere was a pastor in New York City in the 1850s. And what he did, he was pastoring this small church that was struggling, and he asked, Lord, what would you have me to do? Lord, what would you have me to do? Let me give you some background. How many realize history repeats itself? Okay, it's just, if we don't learn from it, we just go through it again and again and again. I want to give you just a little background of why he prayed that prayer. What was happening? He prayed it in 1857. 1857. In 1857, there was this battle going on in our states of slavery versus free, what we call free soilers. Where should we expand slavery? The states were pretty well even. There were just as many free states as there were slave states, but the nation was growing and we were adding states. And so the next state to be added would have been Kansas. And how many realized when you have even, if you add another state, one of the groups is going to have more votes than the other in our Congress and Senate. So it was very important, is that going to be a slave state or a free state? And the states right through the middle of our country had these battles quite regularly. So what they did is they came up with the solution, let Kansas vote itself, what they wanted to do, to allow slavery in their state or not. Well, the slaves, people that supported slavery in Kansas were outnumbered 3-1 on the election of a constitution. And so what they did is they had an election, but when they counted the votes, the slave state people won, even though they were outnumbered 3-1. So they did a recounting of it. They found out one district that had 130 legal voters had 2,900 people vote. Another district that had 1,600 registered voters, and they checked it, those 1,600 people were actually registered in Cincinnati, Ohio, and they voted in Kansas. Because of that, the anger, as you can imagine, boiled over, and some people from the slave area came up and killed 5 settlers that were against slavery. Well, one man that preached the Bible, and the verses he preached were an eye for an eye, and pretty well just left it at that. That's the only verse in the Bible he really used, was John Brown. John Brown went and said, well, because of an eye for an eye, went to a place called Potawatomi and killed 5 pro-slavery people, 5 for 5, eye for eye. Well, the press hated that. And so they started talking in the newspapers. The thing is, everybody in the North, in the newspapers, the only articles they ran were how people in the South killed Northerners. Everybody in the South, the only articles they ran were John Brown. And so there was just a little bias in the press. One senator came forward and complained about this. His name was Charles Sumner. He was a senator and said, what's happening in Kansas is an atrocity. We need to revote. It's not a slave state. And he gave an impassioned speech. Well, someone from the South, Preston Brooks, didn't appreciate his speech, came out with a cane and beat him on the Senate floor. Charles Sumner beat him within an inch of his life, putting Charles Sumner in and out of hospitals for the next 4 years, unable to serve in the Senate, but his state continued to vote him in as a symbol, while everybody in the South, Preston Brooks, broke his cane, hitting him, and they sent him hundreds of new canes and said, take on the rest of them. The president at that time was James Buchanan. He has been voted basically the worst president to ever serve. Look it up. It's there. He didn't censor Preston Brooks. He didn't call for a recount. He just stepped back and he said the government's not responsible for this and stayed away from it all. And to add to it, economic collapse was 2 weeks away. That was our nation. So a pastor of a struggling church was praying in New York City with all this going on and saying, Lord, what would you have me to do? What are we supposed to do? Isn't that an incredible question? What are we supposed to do? God laid on his heart, he said, call a prayer meeting. So he called a prayer meeting. They advertised it all over New York City, put up posters everywhere. He said, we're praying from 12 to 1. Please come join us. If you can't join the whole time, just come when you can. He went there and started praying. Nobody else showed. Not one single person showed. He prayed all by himself for a half hour. And then half hour later, 6 people came in. So there were 7 of them, and they just joined for the last half hour and prayed. The next week, they said, let's do it again. They met. The 7 of them prayed again. For 1 hour, 7 people in New York City, 2 weeks, they prayed. The 3rd week, the stock market collapsed, and it fell apart. As you can imagine, the 3rd week, on that morning, hundreds of people showed up. The next week, hundreds more, and eventually they said, let's not pray once a week, let's pray every day. What started people is a great awakening revival that started to spread. Ohio heard about what was happening in New York. They called prayer meetings, and people started to pray. Chicago heard about it, and they were calling people to pray. This move of God swept around the world as prayer meetings went up. They estimate at one time in the United States alone, 20,000 people a week were being baptized into the faith. 2 years before the nation was going to be torn apart by a civil war, a move of God happened. And what he said is, God, what would you have me to do? And what I want to look at is that question, what would you have me to do? But I want to look at something just a little bit addition to it. How do I know if I'm doing it?